Please welcome our moderator, UK editor of Mashable, Anne-Marie Tomchak, the head of UN World Food Programme's London office, Greg Barrow, and the director of Humanitarian Public Health Team at Save the Children UK, Matthew Wingate.
They're gonna see us from outer space, light it up, like we're the stars of the human race. When the lights turn down.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Anne-Marie Tomchak, and I'm the UK editor for Mashable, which it's a media company that does a lot of coverage around technology, science, the environment, and social media. And I am delighted to be joined here this morning with Matthew Wingate from Save the Children UK, and we are also here with Greg from the World Food Programme, Gregory Barrow. He's the head of the World Food Programme in the UK. The title of our discussion this morning, we've only got 20 minutes to get through this, but the title of it is Action in a Time of Crisis. And Greg and Matt, I'm going to call you Greg and Matt, I've abbreviated both of your names, I hope you don't mind. It really strikes me that this really is a time of crisis, because crisis is happening right on our doorstep. You just saw the news headlines yesterday in London, the London Tower fire in Grenfell Tower. We're going through a period of huge political and social change. In the US, the Trump administration, there's a big change there. Here in the UK, we voted for Brexit, and also obviously with the general election last week. So how do each of you approach reaching people about the crises going on in the world when we've got so much going on our own doorstep? Matt, I'll come to you first.
Well, you're right. It's an unprecedented time of crisis, and I reflect as a young parent about what it's going to be like to grow up in these unstable times, but also as an aid worker who's worked across the world for the last 20 years in crises. It does feel like an unprecedented, complex time. We see the threat of famine in 4 countries in a context where normally we wouldn't expect. Famine is a man-made disaster. Famine is something that we can stop on any given day with the right momentum and the right support. And right now, we see famine threatening Somalia, South Sudan, Nigeria, Yemen, as well as countless other emergencies around the world. And that's what crisis looks like to me. But as I was saying to you just before we began, Anne-Marie, was what I've also seen in the last 20 years of aid work is I've been a real convert into the power of mobilization and how much of a difference it makes if people really begin to share and talk and take interest in a solidarity type way in these type of crises.
We'll talk a little bit more about that in a second, but Greg, working with the World Food Programme, you're doing a lot on the ground, and you two both work very closely together. It's not like you're both separate organizations, they are intrinsically linked. How do you reach people about a crisis when people already feel like they have so much going on right on their doorstep?
Well, Matt has very ably laid out eloquently the situation we face in terms of the crises that are in front of us at this moment in time. And I know it's a bit of a cliche to say this, but we face that against the backdrop of a dramatically changing media landscape. In the time that I've worked for the United Nations World Food Programme over the past 14, 15 years, we've moved from a situation where we had a fairly straightforward conversation, a dialogue with traditional media organisations if we wanted to get the conversation going and the messages out there, to one that we are looking at a sea of different information sources, and still, even though we have a fairly slick and sophisticated operation, trying to work out which buttons and levers to push in engaging that population of more ordinary members of the public who we are trying to encourage to become our voices, to raise the concern to a higher level, because it's a very, very crowded space, as you've laid out, Anne-Marie. There's a lot going on in the world right now. There was a snapshot earlier this year about famine that went on for a couple of weeks when famine was declared in South Sudan, but now it's largely disappeared without trace. But I can tell you that the situation on the ground has not changed. If anything, it's got probably worse. But the conversation about those 4 countries facing famine has largely disappeared, and we need to find a way of inspiring people to drive that conversation up the agenda again.
there are a lot of different challenges in terms of A, highlighting the issue, and then B, reaching, getting that message out to the receiver. And we'll talk about that in a moment, but ultimately, who is responsible? You guys are doing great work in trying to tackle some of the world's biggest challenges, but who's responsible for all of this? Is it governments? Is it individuals? Is it the social platforms? Is it the media? Who needs to take control of this situation?
It's a huge question. I mean, I'll take the first bite and then I'm going to look
for
to
it,
you to
Greg.
carry on. But ultimately, governments are responsible, the governments in the countries where these problems occur, but many of them simply don't have the resources or the inclination to deal with these issues themselves. So then it becomes the responsibility of the so-called international community, of which we are all members. But when we talk about the international community, I think we imagine, first of all, the big rich governments of the world, the governments of North America, the governments of Europe, the governments of some of the leading Asian nations. It's remarkable how few countries around the world are providing the majority of funds to deal with these issues on the ground. And the way it's presented to us is often it's the public that sticks its hand in its pockets and pays for these things. But the scale of these crises is so enormous that the public alone cannot deal with this. I mean, we're looking at 20 million plus people who need assistance right now. And this sheer scale is something that's quite daunting.
So when you see something like 20 million plus people who need help, there is a potential or a possibility that when someone sees that big number, it doesn't quite filter through. And if you think about some of the big stories that have gone really, really viral, they've often been about an individual. Like, let's take this crisis in Syria, for example. Alan Kurdi, the little boy who sadly died when he was trying to move with his family and get out of Syria. We have Amran Daknish, the little boy who was pictured in the ambulance trying to flee Aleppo. And then there's Bana, who's on Twitter constantly posting about the crisis in Syria as well. These are individuals who have captivated the public. Yep. So there's a spike in interest, but how do you keep that interest going?
Yeah. So I think our responsibility, I speak as a responder that works with people that generate the content. But I think our responsibility as an aid organisation, as the front line of the response to these crises, is to show those stories as well as to help. Because by showing those stories and by showing them in an accessible way and of course in a shareable way, as you've described, that's what will build the momentum. Momentum is a huge, huge factor in how effectively the international community and indeed people's own governments respond to a crisis. We can't underestimate it ever. The momentum that generates from a single Alan Kurdish image, the tragic image of that, the momentum was game-changing in terms of politics, in terms of resources, in terms of solidarity with communities around the world. And we have to, I think, we're not a media agency, but what we are is we're on the front line. So my team was on the front line in Wingate State, the one area where we have famine in South Sudan at the moment, and are operating health clinics next to burnt out facilities, under canvas, next to burnt out facilities. And our responsibility is to show those stories, show the queues of people that are coming from miles around to come for a vaccination, for access to food, not because they want to, not because they're lazy, but because this is a last resort. And our responsibility is to show that, and then to work with partners like yourselves and like the traditional media agencies and like everybody in this room and online, to then build the momentum that generates the interest, that generates the support.
Greg, you want to pick up there?
And to show that it really makes a difference as well. I think you've highlighted some of the examples that have really cut through, but one of the things that we've found that makes a real difference, it's a very simple thing, is to show what the impact of this assistance is. To put it bluntly, the before and after images of a child that's suffering from severe malnutrition, what they look like a few weeks later when they've been helped in clinics. Or given the medical care that they need, or access to clean water or shelter. I think that has a huge amount of impact, because I think sometimes confronted by the scale, it can seem overwhelming, but also slightly depressing that it's just happening again. I think we need to show that it is effective, that it has impact, and it has real results.
I might come in on that. I I completely agree with you. I think we have our chief executive's office in Save the Children is named after a child named Uni, whose story came from the last famine in East Africa 5 years ago, when 250,000 people were killed. And actually her story comes from when she was essentially on death's door, weighed less than a bag of sugar at the age of 18 months, and was saved. But actually her story didn't end at that point. So on the one hand, it was a remarkable story of success, that aid makes a difference and that we were able to bring this child back from death's door. But sadly, 2 years later, she died from diarrhea because her body was so depleted by the impact of the drought at that time, and she didn't have the ability to then fight such a simple thing as diarrhea, which could be treated with water and oral rehydration, salt and sugar, basically. And I think the point that Greg makes about how these stories don't go away when the media goes away, and her story certainly didn't, and how it's our job to continue to tell those stories in solidarity and to build the momentum and to continue to respond for the duration is really, really important. And so that's just one example of where I think staying with the cause, and where people online can continue to stoke interest and build interest and remind people that this thing hasn't gone away for as long as is necessary.
Well, let's talk about that, and the different challenges that there are in terms of reaching the audience or reaching individuals. In terms of how information is distributed now, you mentioned, Greg, that there's been a complete shift. The media landscape has completely changed. The way in which we receive information has changed. I have my device right here, which is most likely 90% of the time the way I am going to encounter information. And even if I follow the World Food Programme on Facebook or Twitter or Instagram or wherever that may be, and Save the Children for that matter, that doesn't necessarily mean that that's the first thing I'm going to see on my timeline, because there are an awful lot of other agents at play, such as the algorithm, such as other grassroots movements, trying to clutter that timeline. How do you get over those challenges?
I mean, it's hugely challenging. I think maybe we need an algorithms for aid organisation that will actually help us break through that. But the dynamics, as you know, are often driven by money. It's a pay-to-play environment. If you want to cut through on social media, you have to pay for the promotion.
So you mean like sponsored content?
Exactly. And we as an organisation have a policy of not paying for advertising, not paying for promotion. So we're having to find other ways around it. So this is where we look to you, the audience, and other influencers to really help us to amplify that message and get it out. And we're looking at unusual actors in this space. Just recently, just this year, we've been engaging a network of international chefs, not your high-level Jamie Oliver type chefs, but chefs that have a very, very dedicated following, who really are interested in particular people who are working in a very, very particular culinary space. And when they say something about the situation in South Sudan or Syria, their followers really sit up and listen and are likely to do something in terms of sharing that information further. So those micro-influencers are becoming increasingly important for us.
I'm wondering, putting myself in the position of everyone sitting here, individuals sitting here in the audience, thinking about the terribly sad situation in East Africa, the famine there, the situation in Syria and other crises. And the question that comes to mind for me is, how can I help? What can I do? It's just little old me, do I donate money or do I share information on social media? What's the priority? What's the best way of actually taking action in this time of crisis?
I think it starts with, from a perspective of you do what you can, and you do. So, but that for me starts with.
Is it about money?
It isn't only about money by any stretch, actually, and actually the power of social media has shown that time and time again. It's not about the power of the individual money. Clearly, that's an important thing that individuals with the ability to do that can do, and we welcome and are grateful for every pound that we receive of that. But actually, it's first and foremost, it's about caring and stoking up an interest in yourself in a globalized world where there are problems that are happening around the world. Is to think about what is important and interesting to you, and learning about it, researching it, understanding it in a really simple way, and then sharing it and getting others to care. Because I said to you, I'm a convert to this. I have seen again in East Africa, the situation in East Africa 5 years ago, 250,000 people were killed as a result of this. This time, with the power of mobilization, not just of experts on the ground or of aid agencies or of the UN, the public have helped to trigger a response earlier. They've helped to mobilize their governments, whether it's in the UK, in the US, or other countries, to actually do more. They've also given very generously, but they've continued to trigger that interest that really genuinely results in action on the ground.
But how has this happened again? You know, why are we in this situation again?
But that question is at the root of the problem or the challenge that we face, I think. I mean, I think we need a really grown-up conversation across these digital platforms, across the networks of everyone who has access to social media, about what it means. I think there's we've sort of lulled ourselves into a false understanding about these problems, that you can solve them and they just go away, when in actual fact they are chronic and enduring. We wouldn't imagine in this country a government coming in and saying, okay, it's going to solve unemployment and it's just going to go away. It's something that we have to live with, and it's something that we have to manage. And I think that to a certain extent we were done a disservice back in the 1980s with Live Aid, which said, chuck a load of money at the problem and it will go away. I think we need to get beyond that and accept that this is going to endure, and we need to really, really tap into what's available in the social space to raise that conversation up and deepen the understanding about what it's going to take in the long term to really address it.
And how does what's happening in East Africa affect what's happening to Jane, who lives up the road in East London? How does that affect that individual, you know?
I think it affects them in a very deep way. In this election that just passed, I think governments were running shy of any kind of serious conversation about aid because it had become a sort of toxic issue in the UK media. So there's a sort of zero-sum game that if we give money to East Africa, we can't give money to hospitals in the UK, and that's how it affects them. People are getting drawn into a fake conversation about one thing as opposed to another, when it has to be both, and it has to be both in a serious way.
One of the things that I encounter day to day in my job as a journalist is the sheer level of noise and information that's being distributed on digital media. With that comes misinformation. And the World Food Programme and Save the Children are both very reputable organisations, but do you find that this is also a challenge, that there's mixed information coming out there from various different people with different agendas about the problem at hand?
Yep.
And how do you get around that?
I think it's a great question. I think social media is a great force for good, but can provide all sorts of misinformation, and we encounter that on a day-to-day basis. But it's also an opportunity for us to look at how we work as an aid organisation. We use other people's money to help other people, and the social media has really provided an opportunity for us to strengthen our transparency and our accountability to those people that we help, and from those people who we are helped.
Do people reach out directly to you for information?
Absolutely, they do. On a daily basis, they come to us, and traditionally they would have called or written to our supporter services team. Now, of course, they reach out to us on social media. Whether they reach out to us, whether they're a supporter here in the UK, or whether they're somebody we're trying to help in the deepest furthest reaches of East Africa. And so, one of the things that we really want to do more of is to connect that full spectrum, from the person that gives right through to the person that receives the benefit. And we're working very hard through the stories that we tell and through our information that we share online to really help strengthen that line, so that people know that the difference that they're making as individuals, and that people who are benefiting are challenging us if it's not working for them, just as you would if you went into a shop and bought something that didn't work.
So that actually leads me perfectly onto my next question, Greg. learning from things that happen on social media and using data to actually inform your decisions. Is that something that the World Food Programme is capitalising on? And let's talk about innovations after you answer that question.
Well, very much so. And I think we've talked a lot about what people in this environment can do. But there's a huge opportunity out there, not just with social media, but with the saturation and penetration of the hardware, the mobile phones, the smartphones in regions like sub-Saharan Africa, to gather much more granular data about many, many more people. We are conducting mobile phone surveys in the midst of emergencies, reaching hundreds of thousands of people, and accessing that data on a regular basis is literally transforming the way that we work.
And you guys are doing really, really innovative things. I mean, I was having a look at the World Food Programme's Facebook page last night, and I was stalking it on Twitter as well. And I was quite amazed, actually, at how technologically advanced. And I don't mean that in a patronising way at all, because you guys are doing stuff around blockchain and Bitcoin, and you have this app called Share the Meal. Tell us a little bit about some of those tech innovations. Share the Meal, that's a really interesting app.
Share the Meal is a social app for people in the UK and in developed industrialized nations to contribute by making a micro donation every time that they have a meal, and it's simply a way of engaging our audience, one of many, many different ways that we're trying to engage our audience. And then the other innovation that you mentioned is more on the operational side. We're looking at what we can do using the technology that is out there in a more practical fashion to help us not just reach the right communities and populations in areas where they're under stress, but reach them with the kind of assistance that is more appropriate to their needs. We are way beyond the days of handing out bags of food to people. We're in a realm now where we're not just moving beyond bags of food, but we're actually giving people digital payments via their mobile phones that they then go and redeem at shops and buy their own food. It's a dramatically changed landscape.
Can I ask you, I'm conscious of the time, so we're going to have to wrap up shortly, but can I ask you what would be, and this is a horrible question, by the way, if you had one problem to solve first in terms of prioritising, what would it be?
Goodness me. For me, I think you talked about complexity in terms of the amount of noise. For me, it's about how do we bring together all of that complex information, all of the root causes that result in, that drive these crises, all of the complicated ways that we have to work with governments and with in insecure areas to be able to make the change. How do we boil all of that down across 100 emergency responses around the world? How do we bring that together in a simple way that makes people care about it, understand it, and take action with it? And doing that is one of the greatest challenges for us. But the difference that it makes when we are able to do it is vast.
Greg?
I'm going to go very operational because the World Food Programme is a big operational agency. If I could change one thing, I'd like to take conflict out of the equation of humanitarian disasters, because it's an absolute game changer. We learnt over the past 2 or 3 years that we stopped famine in Ethiopia, mainly because the country was at peace and we were able to get access to the populations, work with the government. The government itself carried out a lot of the aid activities. But we look at these 4 countries that are facing famine at the moment, they're all to one degree or another involved in a conflict situation. And if we can find the political will to remove conflict from that equation, we can make a massive step forward.
It's so complex though. I mean, I think to Bana, who I'd mentioned earlier, and Omran Daknish in Syria, and these are people who, young children who have captivated people on social media, but they've also become politicized.
Absolutely.
And so it's such a challenge to, as a journalist, to report on this firstly, and then as people who are trying to bring about change and tackle those problems, there are lots of different agents at play.
we can't, we can and always must be politically neutral, but we can't be politically blind. The situations that we're dealing with are inherently political. They're about people fighting against each other for power or resources or other things. And so we have to understand who we're working with. Social media is an important part of that. Talk to the people that we're working with so that we can save people in the moment, but also to continue to drive this message that Greg's also just said, which is that it's political solutions that will drive peace, that will drive resources to an area, that will improve governance, and that ultimately is the holy grail that I think we're all aiming for.
Okay, so political solutions, early action, and personal responsibility on the part of all of us. As a final thought, what would you say to each and every one of the people sitting right here about what they can do? What's the first thing they can do to take action?
For us, it's less about money, it's less about volunteering, it's about raising that conversation, keeping the conversation alive. We respect the fact that this audience and audiences like this have many, many other distractions, many other issues that have to be addressed. But if you can help us in a small way with your networks to ensure that the people living in those countries like Nigeria, like South Sudan, like Somalia, like Yemen are not forgotten, that is extremely valuable to us.
Yeah. I would agree with that entirely. I think about what's important to you. Think about how it connects with you and your family, and then stay the course with it. Doesn't mean you have to do everything or share everything, but really try and engage in an issue and show solidarity with that issue by sharing it, engaging with your friends, talking about it. And sure, if you can take some practical steps around giving and so on, that's great, but it's not all about that.
So sharing with your friends, even if you just have 5 followers on social media who are very good friends of yours, that can actually have a really big impact.
Absolutely, absolutely. We've seen it time and again, the mobilization that creates of sharing content, but also of talking about it and of making other people care about it. I do it with my friends outside of this sector, and the momentum and the swell and the conversations, you hear them coming back round to you, and then I see when my team goes to East Africa or elsewhere to respond, you see the momentum that creates, not only in resources, but in the action from governments around the world as well.
And it's very clear that those 5 people, if that message comes from a friend or a relative, they're going to trust that message much more than if it comes from a stranger or it's a headline in a newspaper.
And trust is a really major issue at the moment. That is all we have time for, unfortunately. We could definitely talk about this for so much longer. Gregory Barrow from the World Food Programme, thank you very much, and Matthew Wingate from Save the Children.
Thank you.